Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Be sure to type your questions in the chat box. And presenting today, Mushrooms of Illinois, is Dr. Andrew Miller, Research Professor and Director of the Herbarium at the Illinois Natural History Survey at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thank you, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Christine. And I'm very impressed with the turnout that we have today. This is wonderful. It's happy to see so many people. Looks like we're up to 147 participants today. And if you haven't done so already, I think you should be able to see a poll up there, just general curiosity for myself and the other co-host on the reason why you're attending this. It looks like we have about 20% of the people are interested in foraging for the pot, and general curiosity is the largest at 64%, along with a few other reasons as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully everyone can see my screen, and obviously everyone can hear me. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking today, obviously, about the mushrooms of Illinois. First time I've done this as a Zoom meeting. Usually it's an in-person meeting. And as Christine said earlier, please type your questions in the chat box. I will try to answer them as I go through the presentation, but if they get too numerous, we may have to wait until the end of the presentation. But don't be shy to go ahead and ask questions. Okay. So today, the basic outline of my talk is going to be a very brief introduction to fungi, and then I'm going to transition into the major groups of mushrooms. And finally, we will talk a little bit about the edible and poisonous species of mushrooms. And we're basically going to take a virtual foray throughout the year, starting in spring and going to summer and fall, and talking about some of the edible and poisonous species as we wrap up. But first, I want to just give you a broad overview of what fungi are and how mushrooms fit into that overall group, and then briefly cover a couple of the major groups of mushrooms. So this is a pie chart that is supposed to represent all of life on Earth. As you can see, there's a lot of different organisms here. The chordates at the very top, including anything with backbones like you and I, and deer and dogs, and then plants, mollusks, etc. And what you may notice is that the largest piece of pie is the insects, colored here in blue. But the second largest one is this brown one, known as the fungi. And if we look at this second largest piece of pie here, the fungi, what we see is there's around 1.5 million species estimated worldwide for fungi in general, but we've only described about less than 10% of these, so only around 120,000 species have been described so far. So fungi are the second largest group of organisms on Earth, and it's important to remember that. There's a lot of them out there, and we'll get into the good things and bad things that they do. This is a similar type of pictorial diagram, just kind of showing life on Earth. And as you can see, this fly is very huge to represent the largest number of species, but you can see how large the mushrooms are relative to the elk there to the right of it. The elk, the mammals, you and I, we're very insignificant when it comes to number of species compared to insects and fungi. So how many fungi are out there in the world? Like I said, there's estimated to be over 1.5 million worldwide, but probably over 20,000 mushrooms occur in the United States. And when we say, we've now switched terms from fungi to mushrooms. So fungi is obviously everything from your little bitty microscopic molds to little bitty chytrids that occur in the water, and including the large macroscopic mushrooms as well. But when we say mushrooms, I'm referring more to those large fleshy organisms that are quite charismatic and quite photogenic. So we believe there's over 20,000 mushrooms in the US and probably over 2,000 mushrooms in Illinois. So as the state mycologist, it's sometimes difficult when someone sends me a picture of a partially eaten, half rotten brown mushroom. I have a 1 in 2,000 chance of getting it correct, right? So it's not the easiest thing to go and identify these mushrooms sometimes because there's so many out there. Excuse me. So this is out of a nice book in 1995, Poisons and Panaceas. And basically what this kind of shows is the good, the bad, and the ugly of fungi. So if we have around 100,000 or 120,000 described species, 20,000 of these are fleshy macrofungi, or the mushrooms. We can go down any of these paths. We'll start with the one on the left side and see that there's around 400 species that are probably poisonous throughout the US. 20 of these are somewhat common, but really only less than 6 of these are really lethal mushrooms. And poisonous means it's going to make you sick. Lethal means it's going to make you dead, right? So there's a difference between just being poisonous and being actually lethal. Of course, you don't want to run into those 6 common lethal mushrooms. That would be very bad, or even the 20 common poisonous ones. But it kind of puts it into perspective relative to the total number of species. Now, if we go down this other path to the right here, we see 2,000 species are probably edible. In the middle, we see around 100 species are widely picked, and probably 15 to 30 species are commonly eaten, right? So these are the things many people know of as Morels or Chanterelles, chicken of the woods, hen of the woods, things that we will get into a little bit later in my talk. Of the 2,000 species that are probably edible, there's 80 species grown experimentally. 40 of these are grown commercially on a large scale. And you can walk into any grocery store these days and commonly find 5 to 6 species grown on quite a large scale that are in your grocery store. When I was growing up as a kid, and I'm not that old, there was only one mushroom, right? And it came in a can, and you usually put it on your pizza, and that was the only mushroom you'd find. But now, today, you can go into most grocery stores and find several different varieties of species being grown large scale. And not only grocery stores, farmers markets, and other places as well. So I'll start with the bad when it comes to the importance of fungi. Here's this nice article in Nature talking about fearing fungi. And most of you have probably heard, it's been around the longest, that there's these chytrids, these type of fungi that are attacking frogs and have killed many frogs. Most of you probably have heard of bat white nose syndrome that has killed over 6 million species of bats, or 6 million species, 6 million individuals of bats throughout the United States. There's a pathogen that's attacking snakes now, and a new emerging pathogen that is causing a shell disease in some different aquatic turtles. So unfortunately, there's a lot of pests and pathogens and pests out there, and I'm not even getting into the fungi that attack crops commercially or trees, but there's a lot of those out there as well. But there's also some good that fungi do, a lot of good. So if you're familiar with any of these beverages or food items, the citric acid in your soda or pop is produced by a fungus. Any of these alcoholic beverages or the yeast that occur in bread all come from the fermentation, alcoholic fermentation, thanks to yeast, which are fungi. And your blue-black cheeses are inoculated with different species of penicillin to give it a different flavor. And then, of course, after World War II, or about that time, we discovered penicillin, right? And that, of course, comes from a fungus, Penicillium, that produces penicillin, and that's saved millions and millions of lives. So there's a lot of good things for fungi as well. This is as deep as I'm going to get into the anatomy of mushrooms. I just wanted to give you all sort of a general overview so we could all speak kind of a common language when I talk about the cap of a mushroom. The scientists use the term pileus. They may or may not have scales on the cap of certain mushrooms. There's this thing called a stem or a stipe for many of the mushrooms. Some may have them, some may not. And there may or may not be a ring or an annulus around this stem. Underneath the mushroom, there's normally things that look like gills. But there can also be pores and teeth and other things that we'll get into later in my talk as well. And then for some of the mushrooms, it's mostly the ones you want to stay away from, such as the deadly amanitas. At the very base of the stem or stipe, many times buried underneath the soil level, is this thing known as a cup or a vulva as well. And it's this cup and this ring that usually give away the amanitas. Those are obviously the deadly poisonous ones that we definitely want to stay away from. So there's two major groups of mushrooms, and this is all I'm going to use as far as taxonomy goes. I'll just introduce the Ascomycota and Basidiomycota, and there's a method to my madness for this because there's a couple different groups that I'll introduce you to when we look at the major groups. We just commonly refer to the Ascomycota as Ascos and the Basidiomycota as Basidios, just to make it simpler. And they're easily differentiated if you have a microscope and you want to look at it in depth. The Ascos produce 8 spores on the inside of these sac-like structures known as asci, whereas the Basidios produce 4 spores on the outside of Basidia. So if we take a look at one of these common mushrooms that a lot of us know and love, and some of us may want to be outside hunting for right now, this is a common yellow morel, right? And if we take this and section it across the middle right here, what we see is there's a hollow part on the inside, a hollow stem, and then there's these radiating fingers or gills. And if we take one of those and we stain it blue with blue and purple dyes, what we can see, and we blow it up on a microscope, we can kind of see along this finger here. And then we blow it up even more, and lining that entire finger are these sac-like structures known as asci that are typically filled with 8 spores, right? So now I'm sure you're wondering, well, how did the spores get out of that sac-like structure? And this is how. We can use another stain that will stain this little lid at the top, usually a dark blue color. And it doesn't work for all, but for some. And you can see what happens is, the osmotic pressure builds up inside the sac-like structure. So basically got a lot of water pressure building up. And when it reaches a certain point, that little lid is going to break here, and it's going to pop open, and all the spores are going to go shooting out. So pretty simple way of releasing its ascospores. Similar thing for the basidios is you have all of these things known as basidia that are lining the gills. And if you take one of these gills and you lay it on a microscope and look under high power, you may or may not want to stain it with some certain stains to have the structure show different colors, but this has been stained with blue and reddish dyes. What you're going to end up seeing is there's these structures known as basidia right here that have spores on the outside. And if you blow those up under, say, a scanning electron microscope even more, you'll see that there's these structures known as basidia with these little horns sticking up, typically 4 horns. You can see them over here a little more clearly. So there's 4 horns with 4 basidiospores on them. And that's really the difference. You have 8 ascospores within a ascus, or you have 4 basidiospores on top of basidium. Okay, so that's it for my introduction to the fungi. I want to talk a little bit now more about the major groups of mushrooms that I just introduced you to. So we'll start with the ascos, or the Ascomycota first. And we're going to cover these 5 major groups that more or less kind of follow the handout that we've put online for you. And we'll talk briefly about the morels and the false morels, and then we'll talk about the cup fungi, some flask fungi. I'll introduce you to tubers and truffles, and then finally lichens as well. So this is the one we all are seeking right now, or many of us are seeking for the pot right now, is the morel. And we'll talk more about when it comes up and where we can find it, and all kinds of good questions a little bit later in my talk when we look at the edible and poisonous species. So we do have a question already about when morels are picked. Can we somehow release the spores? No, they actually do that for you. By the time you find morels, most of the time they've already shot off their spores and released them. I know this because I had an undergrad student one time find a bunch of morels of different stages, even small ones and large ones, and they had a really hard time finding the asci with the ascospores in them. I think by the time you find them, most of the time those are already shot off and gone. So I wouldn't worry too much about them not releasing their spores. They do a good job of doing that on their own. Those are the morels. There's other ones that come up this time of year, which are much larger, have a white thick base, and have a reddish brown cap. They are called the false morels. And of course they look nothing like morels, but sometimes they can get confused because they come up at about the same time of year. We'll transition on to the cup fungi, these nice little bright red scarlet elf cups that come up usually during the summer. There's also other cup fungi that come up during the spring and throughout the year that mostly grow on soil, these little brown cup fungi. And like I said, we'll get into some of these more on the edible and poisonous part towards the end of my talk. There's these things known as flask fungi. These are commonly referred to as carbon balls, and they're usually growing on wood. They're great big kind of hard things, obviously not edible. The interesting thing is if you go and cut them, you can see these rings. They look a little bit more like a tree ring, right? These different tree rings. And the mushroom in this case, this carbon ball, went to all the trouble to produce the fruiting body in order to lay down a fertile layer of asci and ascospores. Those all get shot off. Instead of building a whole new structure, what it does is it lays down another ring as well, and then it forms asci and ascospores, and it does it again and again and again and again and again. I don't think it does it on a yearly basis like a tree does, so you can't count this thing and say, oh, well, there's 10 rings here, so it's 10 years old. It just does it when the conditions are right. But each one of these would have laid down that layer of asci and ascospores and shot it off. And the reason they're called carbon balls, if you ever touch them, they're really black and powdery and stain your fingers black like carbon. There's also these other interesting fungi known as cordyceps. Some of you may read articles about the ant killers or wasp killers. And that's what these things are. These are in the ascos. The spores land on an insect or a spider or some invertebrate. And basically, what they do is end up growing throughout the body of that invertebrate. A lot of times, the fungi have chemicals in it that tell the invertebrate to dig underground, which is what happened in this case. So down here at the very bottom of this is a little wasp. Or an ant or a beetle, something like that. And the fungus is then fruited up through here, up through the soil layer. So most of the time when you're collecting these things, you only see this top portion, of course, and you have to dig way down in the soil to figure out what it's growing on. And that's how you identify many of these things. You have to know what the host was. So you have to get the entire mushroom. They do grow these commercially, and they harvest them and they put them in a bottle known as cordyceps. So if you're in need of stamina and endurance and your added benefit, they're all vegetarian. So you can actually go and buy these things online. Of course, they cut it off here at the soil level. They don't give you this bottom portion. It's just the top portion up here that that is usually bottled and for health purposes. Excuse me. And then we get on to the truffles. There's black truffles. Most of you are probably familiar with these, mostly coming from the regions in Europe, such as Italy and France, where they used to use pigs to hunt them, and now they use dogs to hunt the truffles. So there's these black truffles, quite expensive, and also the white truffles as well. So if anyone wanted to hazard a guess, this is a little quiz. What do you think this lady paid for this white truffle at this Tuscan truffle auction? This is a very large, over 1 or 2 pound white truffle. And if anyone wants to just type some guesses in the chat box, 2,000's a little low, but it's a good guess. And to answer the question about cordyceps exclusively using insects as hosts, yes. Yeah, they don't grow on people. or mammals or anything else. They actually grow on insects exclusively. So I think the closest one we got so far is $250,000. We're pretty close. This one actually went for $330,000 in a auction as well. So, and yes, cordyceps do grow on arachnids. I've found them in Ecuador growing on tarantulas before. So they're pretty cool. Okay, so yeah, that's a lot of money. And everyone always wants to ask, well, can you grow truffles in the United States? And the answer is yes, you can grow them, but they don't taste anything at all like the ones grown in Italy and France, even though you may have the same tree species, the same habitat, the same or similar soil conditions, similar climate, temperature, precipitation. For whatever reason, they just don't grow, or they do grow, but not very well, and they don't taste the same. So that's why Italy and France kind of has the market on truffles. For whatever reason, they can grow them over there. And then last but not least, we have these things known as lichens. And oh yes, sorry. Well, Portland, Oregon area does have truffles. I don't think they're as highly valued as the truffles in England and France, unfortunately. But not all truffles are edible either. There's a lot of things known as commonly called truffles that grow under trees, but they're not edible. Or they're edible, but they're not very tasty, I should say. So the last group in the ASCOs are these lichens. And what these are is an association between fungi and algae, or a cyanobacteria. But mostly it's these green algae that grow in an association with fungi. And you're wondering why they do this. Well, the fungi have this nice wet environment that they can protect the algae from. And the algae live perfectly happy, intertwined between the fungal hyphae, or the fungal threads that the fungi form. And what does the fungus get out of it? Well, fungi can't photosynthesize, right? There's no such thing as a green fungus with chlorophyll. They don't have chlorophyll. They can't produce their own food like plants do, like algae. So the algae actually produce the sugars for the fungi, and the fungi provide a nice home. So if it's really dry or super wet or super cold and you can't find any other fungi or mushrooms out there, you can always look for lichens. They commonly grow on the bark of trees or rocks, or sometimes in the soil. If you ever go down to Garden of the Gods in Southern Illinois, the rock outcroppings are literally just covered with these lichens everywhere. Okay, so to move on with my talk, we're going to get into things that you might be, a little more familiar with, the Basidiomycota, or the Basidios, and we will talk about this general term mushrooms. I'm going to break it up into boletes and polypores, teeth fungi, coral fungi, chanterelles, puffballs, and jelly fungi. And I'll go a little bit quicker here because I want to get on to talk more about the edible and poisonous species. So this is probably the most illustrated mushroom out there. You see it almost in all children's books. This nice fly agaric, it's the Amanita muscaria, is the Latin name for it. Bright red cap with these white scales all over it. Very nice looking mushroom. And of course it has gills underneath it. And if you cut the stem off and lay it on a piece of black paper, what you'll see is a nice spore print if you cover it with a bowl and wait 24 hours. So you can take these spore prints. It's kind of a nice activity to do just to see what spore colors you get. If you have a mushroom you think has darker gills or would produce a darker spore print, you can lay that on white paper and see what kind of interesting patterns or colors that you would end up getting with these spore prints. So those are mushrooms with gills. If you turn a mushroom over and you think it has gills, but it doesn't, it might fool you. It has these pores. They're known as boletes. Some of these with the bright yellow pores have a reaction when a chemical reacts with oxygen and it turns blue. So once you break the cells of these pores, it turns bright blue. As you can see here, someone has kind of wrote a little tiny mushroom here, and it's stained the pores blue. So these staining reactions are sometimes important in identification as well. Boletes can be all kinds of different colors, including this black one known as Old Man of the Woods, which is, got the black pores. It's got this there's another gilled mushroom here growing right next to it, showing you the difference between gills and pores. And then there's these things known as polypores, which are basically a whole lot like boletes. They have pores underneath them, but they have no stipe or stem. Someone kind of cut the stem off and stuck them to a tree, and usually in a shelving pattern, which is why they're also known as shelf fungi as well. So we have a question: do cultivated Cordyceps militaris need an insect substrate? Yes. The answer is yes. For all Cordyceps, they're going to have to have a substrate like a host if they want to grow. So there's these polypores. You turn them over, they have little pores all over the place underneath them, just like the boletes do. These can be quite small pores in some cases, almost too tiny to see with the naked eye. This is called the turkey tail. It's a very common thing throughout the Midwest and occurs all over the place on old dead logs. This usually comes out this time of the year in the spring. This is a brightish orange polypore that has these interesting pores underneath it. And then we get into things that are tooth fungi or teeth fungi, right? So instead of having gills or pores, they have teeth or spines underneath them. They may or may not have a stem or a stalk on them. They could just be attached to wood, like in this case. This is a different tooth fungus in which it has many teeth and has this kind of interesting branching pattern. And then we get into coral fungi. So as you can tell, these common names are pretty easy to understand, right? If they have teeth, they're called teeth fungi. If they have pores, they're called a polypore. If they look like coral, we call them coral fungi. So the common names for the common groups of fungi are pretty simple. And these coral fungi can be quite charismatic, right? So if I was a better photographer, this might even look better, but it's not a bad picture of this nice bright purple coral fungi with the green mossy background. And they come in all kinds of different colors and shapes and sizes as well. This bright orange and bright yellow coral fungi as well. And then we get into things known as chanterelles, which look a whole lot like mushrooms with gills, but they actually have, the gills are not well developed. And sometimes they can just look more like veins and not really true gills. We'll talk more about these in a minute when it comes to edible and poisonous ones. Chanterelles are typically orange, but you can also find these other things in the chanterelle group that are black or brown, and they just kind of look like these big black horns. There's also these things known as puffballs as well. And the reason they're known as puffballs is because they puff, right? So you take one of these big round balls and it gets a crack, usually ends up getting a crack somewhere on the outer surface here. This is a spiny puffball, but it's gonna need a hole. It's gonna have to wear down that outer wall, and you get a crack in there, and then raindrops hit it and puff the spores, and the spores go flying everywhere. Sometimes you'll see these things known as earth stars, which are nothing more than a puffball with two outer wall layers. So the inner wall layer is the puffball itself. The outer wall layer is covering that as well. And then when it dries out, it folds back and kind of forms a star-like pattern. So these are really cool to find lying on the ground sometimes if you see these. They are commonly known as earth stars. Okay, so stinkhorns are another group that you may or may not like to run across because, as the name implies, they kind of stink. And a lot of times I will smell these before I actually see them. They're very common in wood chips, especially whenever you have a lot of moisture. So if you put down a lot of mulch this spring with the cooler, damp, wet conditions that we're having, you may start seeing some of these stinkhorns. The very outer top, or the top layer there that's shown in olive green, is just a big mass of mucus basically, and it stinks really bad. And the reason it does that is it attracts flies, insects, and mostly flies. They come and eat that off the top, but that's where all the spores are. So then the spores get inside the insect, all over its feet, all over the body of the insect, and the insect flies off and spreads the spores for the stinkhorn. So the fungus isn't all that dumb. It's pretty smart about how it disperses its spores. And then last but not least, we have the, well, it's not last, there's actually jelly fungi too. The bird nest fungi, this is blown up a whole lot. Usually these are just a few millimeters in diameter, but they look like little bird's nests with these little eggs on the inside. And inside each of those eggs is where the spores are. So raindrops come and they splice those eggs out of the bird's nest fungi, and then that packet breaks down and releases the spores. And then last but not least, we have the jelly fungi, which basically feel a lot like jelly and look a lot like jelly, usually growing on wood. And they come in a variety of colors, yellow, you can see some white jelly fungi, some are more darker colored, brown, black, or even brown. And one of these, this is called the wood ear, because if you've ever had some Chinese dishes, such as hot and sour soup, you may see something called wood ear fungus. And that's basically what this was. It's cut into strips. This does grow throughout the United States and throughout the Midwest, so it's not too hard to find them on your own. And you cut them into strips, and you can dry them out and keep them for a long time and rehydrate them and put them in soups and other things like that. As far as slime molds be considered fungi, they're fungi with a lowercase f. They actually are more closely related to protists or protozoans. So they're not really considered true fungi anymore, the slime molds. And that's why one reason I don't cover them in this talk. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up the last part of my talk with the last 20 minutes or so that I have here, I would like to get more into the edible and the poisonous species. And we're basically going to just take a virtual tour throughout the spring, summer, and fall. And of course, we will start with the Morels. We'll transition into what we might find during the summer, the Chanterelles. And then we'll get more into the fall when we see more teeth fungi, the boletes, some polypores, puffballs, and then just I want to touch base on other mushrooms that are edible and poisonous as well. So this is kind of what it looks like now outside, right? The red buds are budding. Everything's starting to green up after a long cold winter. The creepy crawlies are starting to come out of hibernation, so we get these nice snakes coming out and wandering about. And then, as I like to say, love is in the air. So the frogs are out doing their thing. And what we're looking for are things like this for many of us is the morels. It's about that time of year, or maybe a little late now, but with this cool, wet spring, the morels should be lasting a little longer than they typically do. It hasn't shot up to 90 degrees and got super dry. So the morels are out. And morels are in the genus Morchella, for those of you that are interested. They have a spring fruiting throughout the Midwest, as many of you know. They usually last 3 to 4 weeks in any given area. If we're lucky, the cap is composed of pits, and they have hollow stems. I'll show you why that's important in a little while. They associate with trees, but as any old morel hunter can tell you, they really can just be found about anywhere for no rhyme or reason sometimes. There's different kinds of morels with a lot of different kinds of names. I usually divide these into the black morels, the half freeze, and the yellows. But as you can read here, there's a lot of different common names within each of these different groups. And for those that are interested, DNA studies have recently shown there's a lot of numerous species, especially with the yellows and the blacks. So throughout the US, we have 16 species of yellow morel and up to 26 species of black morel. For those of you eating them, it doesn't really matter. They all probably taste pretty much the same. They're all edible. You don't have to worry about it if it's a true morel. It doesn't really matter which of these 16 or 26 species they are. So we'll start out with the black morels because in my opinion, these are the ones that seem to come up first, at least in our area. Obviously they have this darker color to them. You can find them in abundance, but they all have the kind of this dark brown to even a blackish color to them, which is why they're known as black morels. If you take them and split them lengthwise, you'll see a couple different things. And one is, I'm just going to point out they have a hollow stem, like I said before. they have these pits on the cap out here, and the attachment is down here at the base of this cap right here, right? That's where the stem kind of attaches to the cap, and you can clearly see that in these examples. And then as the season progresses, we sort of transition more into the half freeze, and you'll find half freeze and blacks at about the same time, but sometimes the half freeze tend to come up a little bit later after the blacks. And they're known as half freeze for a very good reason, is because they are half free. They're half attached and they're half free on this, the cap is. So again, you have this hollow stem right here, but instead of the attachment down here at the base, at the bottom of this stem, it's attached halfway up, right? So it's pretty easy to tell the difference between a half free and a black morel if you just cut it lengthwise. And just to reiterate the point, here's a black on the right with the attachment down here at the base, and here's a half free where it's attached up here. But you can see the cap is a similar kind of color and maybe a little bit smaller on the half freeze. And then there's this other thing known as a thimble cap, which looks a little bit or can look like a half free. And now I'm introducing you for the first time to this thing over here known as a red skull and crossbones, right? So how many of you think that that's a good thing? Right? It's not, just in case you were wondering. That means danger, you want to stay away. I don't think the thimble caps are deadly poisonous, but they can be, they're not lethal, but they can be poisonous and make you sick. The good thing about these thimble caps in the genus Verpa is a common place where you'll find them if you look in the literature. These thimble caps, or these, some people call them false half freeze or false morels, is they're quite uncommon. I don't really find them hardly very often at all, but you kind of want to stay away from them. And they can look a little bit like a half free in some cases. So there's another thimble cap species. But the good thing is it's easy to tell the difference from a thimble cap. And this is one that really does look a lot like a half free. If you look at the cap up here, it looks a lot like a half free morel. But if you go and split it lengthwise, you're going to see this cottony material inside the stem. So for one thing, it's not hollow. It's got a cottony appearance. And look where the attachment is. It's way up here at the very top. It's not here at the base, and it certainly isn't here halfway in between. The attachment's way up at the top. So there's two ways to identify these things. So I would just kind of stay away from those. If you collect half freeze, I would definitely stay away from those things. Or if you collect half freeze, just go ahead and make sure you split them lengthwise. So yeah, I understand that some people probably forage them and eat them. I just would not probably take the chance. So, and yes, Hunter's right when he says there's a controversy over Gyromitra species, which we'll come to in a little bit. And of course, he wants to know where I stand on Gyromitra. So I'll mention that in a minute. Because we will get on to the false morels after we're finished talking about the yellow morels. So, sorry, Hunter is a she, my apologies. The yellow morels, of course, are more yellow, and that is what we're going to come up with, or what we're going to end up finding after the blacks and the half freeze. You can kind of find them at the same time in some situations, but typically towards the end of the season is when you're going to start finding your yellow morels, right? The end of the morel season, I should say. Of course, there's a gray form as well, and there's a lot of controversy over whether these are different species or the same species. I'm not exactly sure if it really matters. If you're just out foraging for the pot, they're all pretty much just yellow or gray morels, and they're all edible. And there also is some interest in whether soil temperature makes a difference or not. So a friend of mine uses his little soil probe. You can see it's 46.2 degrees Fahrenheit for the soil temperature here. And some people think that influences, you know, as the soil has to be a certain temperature before morels start to come up. So maybe they do, maybe they don't. I'm not really for sure. So Yes, I'm familiar with garlic mustard and the inhibition of growth of mushrooms. I'm familiar with it, but I haven't really studied it all that much. So I don't really have an answer for that. I'd have to look in the literature and study up more on that. I haven't really followed that as much as I should have. So where to find morels? Well, unfortunately, I have no magic silver bullet here for you guys. I don't really know. I've looked myself a lot, and sometimes I find them and sometimes I don't. It's just the luck of the draw. But as far as some pointers, obviously south-facing slopes are going to heat up faster than east, west, and northern slopes. So you might want to start looking there. A friend of mine's been hunting for over 60 years, so I get a lot of my information from him. He's the two-time Illinois Morel hunting champion as well, so he seems to know what he's doing. He finds them under living ash, typically the blacks and the common yellow morels. The common yellow morels obviously occur a lot under dead elms too. There seems to be a lot of interest in dead elms. But all of these other kind of tree species seem to be a good place to find the yellow common morels as well. So, and yeah, I can't really answer much about these invasive species such as honeysuckle. I think if your forest dynamics are changing and you're getting less of these species listed here, these tree species, and you get more honeysuckle and garlic mustard and other bad things, that's probably going to decrease morels. But they're really tricky. It's really hard to know. Yeah, so anywhere they want to grow. I've actually found morels next to a tool shed, which there wasn't a tree within a couple 100 feet. So I have no idea why exactly it came up. But anyway, this is what you would love to stumble across. For those with a keen eye, you can probably count the number of morels, yellow morels here, and there's a lot. So that's a great question about what a tree makes a good host for a morel. In my opinion, it's a tree that is dying and the bark is sloughing off. And you may wonder why. Well, if you think about it, mushrooms do not have wings and they can't just fly away when their environment becomes unsuitable. They don't have legs, they can't run away, so they can't fly away or run away. All they can really do is produce spores to blow away in the wind, right? And that's pretty much what morels are doing a lot of times. So if there's any helpful hint I'll give you, these morels, they actually form these relationships with the roots of trees. It's called a mycorrhizal relationship, and I won't go into that too much, but basically the tree is giving the morel sugars through the photosynthesis, and the morel is helping the tree to give it water and nutrients. But when that tree starts to die, such as a dying elm that's 5 or 6 years old, and it gets another fungus called Dutch elm disease, and that elm starts to die, it sends signals to the mushroom, the morels that's living underground, that, hey, there's something's not right, and that morel wants to get out of there. And the only way it can do it is by forming these fruiting bodies, producing spores that blow away and move to another location. So your best bet is to kind of look for sick, dead, and dying trees, and you might be able to find things like this. And after a tree looks like it's dying, usually you could go back for at least another year or two, and sometimes you get a bumper crop of 4 or 5 years. It just kind of depends. So obviously you can harvest a lot of morels at one point in time if you get in the right spot. This is really nice to see. Most of the time I find 1 or 2. And someone mentioned earlier in the chat group about mentioning, the provisions about hunting. So you have to be very careful. This is my disclaimer here, that wherever you hunt, be careful that you're on property that you should be hunting on, and make sure that you've asked the landowner if you're going to hunt on someone else's property. So can you find fungi infected with a host tree and other pathogens? Not that I'm aware of. Usually if it's infected with the host tree, or no, I'm sorry, you can. If you're talking about morels that have a host tree, yes, they can be infected by other pathogens, such as the Dutch elm disease, for example. So anyway, you know, you want to be careful where you're hunting these morels, and we can always talk about that more later. I'll just point out that yes, morels will grow up through rocks. They have a lot of turgor pressure when they start to form these little mushrooms, and they can push their way up through rocks. I've seen them push their way up through asphalt as well, not a morel, but other mushrooms. And this tree also shows that, or this slide also shows that it can grow with red pine, right? You can see these red pine needles scattered throughout. So pine is a place where you can find morels as well. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the false morels. Again, I have the red skull and crossbones. So to answer an earlier question from Hunter, she was wondering about, you know, the controversy whether you should eat them or not eat them. It's a great question, but they unfortunately contain some toxins. Some of the species contain some of the toxins some of the time, and we just don't know that much about them. So it just something that I would probably stay away from. The chemical that's in it is called monomethylhydrazine. It's also a component found in rocket fuel, and it's also heat liable. So I know a lot of people will say, well, I've ate morels my whole life, and it's usually because they cook them thoroughly. So if you cook them up a lot, supposedly it breaks down the chemical and it won't harm you. But that's just sort of people's ideas. I would not eat havelas. For one thing, most of them are usually pretty small, and we don't know enough about havelas. So, unfortunately, Gyromitra is a genus that these false morels occur in primarily. They have wrinkles, not pits. They have these solid stems, not hollow stems or stems with cottony material. The cap is usually reddish brown, and they're generally quite large. So here's one example of this, you know, very large false morel. Has these great big whitish stems and this big brown reddish top. So once you see them compared to morels, it's pretty hard to get them confused, right? This is a slide I showed earlier showing how large they can be. This is an adult size ball cap. So yeah, there's a lot of good eating there. So I could see why people would be tempted to want to take this home after a long day of hunting morels and can't find anything. If they end up finding a false morel, you know, they may be tempted to want to go out and take that home with them and eat them. This is one that is called Gyromitra esculenta, which esculenta in Latin means good eating. It's kind of ironic because this is the one that we know contains the monomethylhydrazine, or this toxic chemical in it, and it seems to contain it a little bit more consistently than some of the other ones. People are trying to work on this now to figure out ways to tell if, you know, certain species have chemicals or not, and we just don't know enough about them for right now. So that's pretty much it for the spring edibles. As we start moving into June and July, we start seeing these things known as Chanterelles in the genus Chanterelles and Craterelles. The Chanterelles usually have these orange or yellow-orange mushrooms, whereas the Craterelles are more black and gray. These things have veins or wrinkles, but not well-developed gills. I like the Chanterelles. They're more of a meatier type mushroom, and they have this nice fruity odor to them, and they always occur on soil, but never on wood. So here's a chanterelle with these kind of not well-developed gills, kind of more vein-like structures. You can find these in great abundance if you look in the right area. You want to find them sooner than later. Nematodes, these little worms, like to get into the stems. Some people don't care, that's just extra protein. Some people want to cut those things out and not really use those. So unfortunately, I don't know what Polyozellis is. It's maybe one of those new species or new genera that people have done, have created. So sorry, I can't ask that, Arrow. But anyway, these chanterelles can be quite good and quite plentiful if you can find them throughout the summer, usually on drier, sandy soils. what you want to stay away from is something that occurs more towards the fall, known as the jack-o'-lantern, and it is poisonous, not deadly, but it can make you sick, and it's much larger and orange. Has more of an orange to it. It has well-developed gills. It usually doesn't occur singly or in pairs. It's clustered, as you can see in this one, where there's 4 or 5 in a cluster, and it occurs at the base of trees. It doesn't occur in soil like chanterelles. So to my knowledge, chanterelles do grow over all of Illinois for the most part. You can find them in a lot of different areas. So yeah, so I was told by in Illinois, always saute mushrooms and never put raw mushrooms on salads. Yes, that's a very good point. I'm glad Karen pointed that out, that none of these species I would recommend eating raw. You know, it's amazing how many people would not go out and just grab a plant and stick it in their mouth, but they think it's okay to do that with a mushroom. Um, so I would not recommend that. I cook all of my mushrooms, anything that I end up eating, because you don't even know if it's the mushroom making you sick. There can be some bacteria or other things on that mushroom or in the mushroom that can make you sick. So I would definitely stay away from eating any raw mushrooms at all. The interesting thing about these jack-o'-lantern mushrooms are they are supposed to be bioluminescent. I've only seen this a little bit, and they usually don't glow this much, but usually the gills are supposed to be bioluminescent. So if you take it into a very, very dark room and let your eyes adjust for 15 or 20 minutes, supposedly you can kind of see that, see some sort of bioluminescence there. And then the black trumpets in the genus Craterellus, usually find these a little bit more in southern Illinois than I do in central and northern Illinois, but I haven't really honestly looked all that much. They are supposed to have a nice kind of nutty flavor to them, and they can come up in black or kind of brown colors. The nice things about these edible mushrooms that I talk about, you can't confuse them with anything else that's going to be poisonous and make you sick. So that's why I like to talk about these certain species that are very safe edibles. So there's these teeth fungi in the genus Herbarium, and as we already covered, they have teeth or spines. They may or may not have a stalk to them. This is just growing on the side of a tree. It's known as the bear's head with these nice big long spines. These can get quite large. And you can also have these ones that branch as well. They branch a lot and have these little teeth or spines. And like I said, you can't really confuse these with anything that isn't edible. And you find these more in the fall. So we're getting into September and October now. So polypores and bracket fungi, which I might briefly mention the pheasant back. I see a couple people talking about that as well. Basically, I was going to talk mostly about chicken of the woods or hen of the woods in the genus Pleurotus or Grifola. These things have pores underneath. They grow on living or dead hardwoods, and like any mushroom, the fresher the better. I've never eaten a pheasant back. It seems very hard to me, and I like my teeth. I don't like to break my teeth, so I think you have to cook the pheasant back quite a while in order to make that thing edible. But that might just be a personal preference as well. It seems a little too hard for me, but yeah, if they're very young, they could, if you get them quite young, they could be tender. Just like the sulfur shelfs in the Grifola, you want to find these things young, and the fresher the better. So sulfur shelf grows usually at the base of these trees, even on dead stumps. They're a bright orange color. Sometimes the tips can be yellowish, but the reason it gets its name is you turn it over and the pores are bright yellow, which is the color of sulfur. So sulfur, and they usually grow in this shelving pattern, so you get sulfur shelf from that. There's also another species out there throughout the Midwest that has bright white pores. That's okay. It's perfectly edible as well. It's just a different species. But I don't think there's anything out there you can really confuse a sulfur shelf with. And then there's these hen of the woods in the genus Grifola. They're usually a brown color. They kind of look like you can imagine looking like a hen sitting at the base of a tree. But you can also imagine how many nooks and crannies there are within this thing for bugs to get into. So I would thoroughly wash this thing, obviously never eat it raw, but you thoroughly want to wash everything out. You'd have to put this one in a 5-gallon bucket and let it soak for a while to try to get all those little bugs and critters that have crawled in there. Even there's some leaves that have, as this thing was growing, the leaves fell down and they've kind of grew around the leaves. So you may not even want to eat the stems either. Sometimes I'll just cut off the outer portions of the of the of the mushroom caps here and just eat the caps and not really the stems, because they seem to be a little bit hard sometimes. And then there's the mushrooms in a couple different genera, Calvaceae and Lycoperdon. We already talked about the spores being produced internally and requiring a hole or a fracture for them to be dispersed. And with these, it's important to remember they're only edible if white on the inside. So here's another quiz for the day. You can see 3 puffballs here. Which one do you think you would not eat? And this really isn't a trick question. I hope that everyone gets this answer correct. There's 2 nice, bright, fresh white ones that are quite large. And yes, exactly. It's this brown one that you definitely want to stay away from. So you do not want to get on the outside of this brown one. It's old. It's probably not the fungus that's going to make you sick, but it's going to be more the bacteria that's decomposing this fungus that you don't want to mess with. There's also these little mushroom or little puffballs that grow on soil or on wood, and you cut them open. If they're bright white on the inside, then they're fine to eat. I've had these. If you cook them in butter, they taste like something in butter. If you cook them with garlic, they taste like something with garlic. I've ate them, but they don't really taste like much of anything to me. So. And to answer Errol's question about scleroderma, yes, we do get sclerodermas in Illinois. They're quite common as well, but they have this hard outer rind on the outside. Some of you may know the skin condition called scleroderma. Well, this is the genus Scleroderma because it's a hard outer rind, but when you cut it open, you see these dark purplish brown spores. And again, you want to stay away from those. Those are definitely not edible like the bright white puffballs. And then just last but not least, to wrap up my talk, I'm just going to generally talk about a couple different mushrooms, the Pleurotus or the oyster mushrooms, and then the Coprinus. These things have true gills. The Pleurotus grows on dead, standing, or fallen hardwoods. The Coprinus tends to grow on soil. Older species can acquire a bright yellow slime mold with the oyster mushrooms or the Pleurotus. And the Coprinus, when they get old, they dissolve into this black ooze. So here's what oyster mushrooms look like. They have these nice gills, well-developed gills. They're white. They're growing on trees, dead hardwoods, most of the time in the fall. You can also buy these in the stores. These things are grown commercially. So there's tons and tons of oyster mushrooms being grown. You can find these in the grocery stores, or you can go out in nature and look for them on your own. There are a couple things that grow in your yard. I wouldn't recommend really eating much of anything that grows in your yard for a lot of reasons, including people put down chemicals on their lawn, and I wouldn't really want mushrooms to be absorbing those chemicals. But you may see this thing called a shaggy mane, and if it's very young and very fresh, it's supposed to be edible. It's in the genus Coprinus. What happens is it very quickly starts to auto-digest. So it starts to actually digest itself. All the cells break down, and they release this black oozy slime. And some people believe this may have been the first ink ever produced when people were writing with ink. And they're called inky caps, is another common name for them for a reason, because the caps ooze this black ink. And then just to wrap up my talk, others to avoid: Amanita, this thing known as chlorophyllum or the green-gilled lepiota, and of course anything you don't positively know. Yeah, the dripping of the spores does help in the dispersal because rain washes away the spores. So here's a typical Amanita. You can recognize it. It's bright white, has these well-developed gills. It has this nice stalk or stem with a ring around it, and it has this well-developed cup at the base. Not all Amanitas have a well-developed cup at the base. This cup in this species has grown into the base and it's very hard to identify, but you can still see that it has a ring around the stipe or around the stalk. I would stay away from any mushroom that's white if you want to be super safe. Just don't eat any mushroom with the stalk like this, and then you have nothing to worry about. The Amanitas, of course, are not just poisonous, they're lethal. So even the one at the bottom there in the man's right hand, if you an adult human, that would be enough to kill an adult human. So it's not worth taking the risk. And then lastly, this is the #1 mushroom throughout the US for mushroom poisonings, mainly because it grows in lawns and ditches where little children are playing and they like to go out, and of course they like to put things in their mouth. Fortunately, it's not lethal, it's just poisonous. It's called the green-gilled lepiota, and it's really the only mushroom I know of that might have a hint of green to the gills as it gets older. But it also has a ring around the stalk. It does not have a cup at the base, but it has this big, huge ring at the stalk, and it has these kind of dark olive type of gills. So I would definitely stay away from that as well. Amanitas and green-gilled lepiotas are, like I said, anything you can't positively identify. And with that, I want to thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm happy to stay on here a little longer and answer some questions. But for the length of brevity, I think I wrapped that up in about an hour. So, and no, I haven't seen Fantastic Fungi yet, but I hope to. I was supposed to go to the theater and see it, but of course, thanks to COVID-19, that didn't happen. So I'll have to stream it online someday. So as far as cleaning morels, I just basically run them under some water and brush off the soil at the base of them. That's about all I do. I don't get too crazy about him. And yes, it's going to be accessible later to watch on the U of I Extension website. Maybe one of my co-hosts can put that into the chat group here. And yeah, Kent, nice to see you on here. You can share the video with moms, Missouri Mycological Association, no problem. I think we can share the share the video on here, or share the link to the video, sorry. And that should be up within a couple days or so. So why do morels seem to be more in burned areas? There are only certain morels that grow in burned areas, and we don't know. It's just it's a certain species, certain different species of morels. I think there's 4 or 5 of them. They're all black morels. They're not yellow morels, and they seem to come up after a fire. It seems to instigate them for some reason, kind of like the pines out west. They need fire to germinate. And no, there's no dangers. I should have mentioned that about touching poisonous or lethal morels or mushrooms. It's not like COVID-19 where if you touch a mushroom in your face, you're going to get sick. No, you can rub the mushrooms all over your body. You won't get sick. You don't have to worry about that. You actually have to ingest the mushrooms if you want to. If you to get sick, you have to ingest the mushroom. So. Oh, great. They're going to send out an email to everyone who's registered. So anyone registered should be getting the link. And we'll put it up there. Why can't morels be commercially produced? That's a great question. People have tried, but it's mostly to deal with this mycorrhizal relationship with the trees. It's a very complex, complicated relationship, and no one's figured it out yet. So my favorite mushrooms, probably chanterelles. I like those the best, just for the flavor and because I can find them a lot easier than morels. Yeah, I don't know about. That's a great question, Veta, about whether overpicking can reduce mushrooms. Um, I think the jury's still out on that, unfortunately. We just don't know. I know they had a scare of that regarding chanterelles in Europe many years ago, and then they had a wonderful wet summer, and chanterelles were all over the place. So it had a lot more to do with temperature than anything else, and precipitation. So it's hard to tell. I suppose, like anything else, you could overharvest an area if you're really good and you find every last morel. But I like to think we're missing more morels than what we're finding. So most important in triggering morels, I think it really has to be, I think it has to be the soil temperature. I'm not sure they care about the air temperature. I know my friend has found morels frozen before, where the temperature was, you know, warm enough the day before, and the morel fruited, and then it snowed overnight, and the morel actually froze the next morning. So um, it's the soil temperature and precipitation. It can't be too wet either. I don't In floodplain ground, I never find morels because it just seems to be too wet sometimes. I don't think it matters if you cut or pluck them. There's a lot of controversy over the two when it comes to morels, but I don't think you're really going to damage them by picking them out of the ground. You don't necessarily have to cut them. There are trumpet mushrooms in Illinois. From my friends have found some in southern Illinois, the trumpet mushrooms, but I've never really found too many around here. Sure, Stephanie, I could do a similar webinar for moms group sometimes. Um, I have been to moms events, especially when I was in grad school, and I was scheduled to speak at NAMA this year as well, but unfortunately that's not going to happen. So yeah, just send me an email at amiller7@illinois.edu. And of course, Maxine knows how to get a hold of me. So I could certainly do a webinar sometime for moms if you're interested. If I've missed any questions, please feel free to just type them in again. With 154 participants, there's still 57 left here, and obviously a lot of good interest and a lot of good questions coming in. So yeah, I had a dryad saddle as well growing on my or I'm sorry, pheasant back growing on my tree, and hollowed the whole thing out. I actually had raccoons in the middle of the tree having babies because the whole middle of the tree was all rotted out thanks to the pheasant back. So I had to take that tree down, but it did produce a lot of pheasant backs. And the dryad saddle, I'm assuming you're talking about Havelas, I guess. And I just don't know enough about Havelas to say much about that. Explanation for why morels are sometimes only found on one side of a tree, not all the way around it. No, Camden, I'm sorry. No idea. Just, I guess, because they want to. Unfortunately, I have no idea why morels would do that. If they're forming a relationship with the tree roots, you would think the tree roots would be all the way around the tree and they would want a fruit. Unless one side's sunnier or the temperature's a little bit warmer on one side, I'm not really for sure. There's actually, honestly, a lot more things we don't know about morels and fungi fruiting than what we do know. Oh, can I explain Lactarius? No, I can't. They have a hyphal system inside that does produce a milky latex, and we don't know why they do it. Maybe it's to ward off herbivory, ward off insects or other things eating it, but we're not really sure why Lactarius produces milk. They just have their own system for doing that.
All right, thanks everyone.